So we have been, we're on week 3 of something that we've really never done here before that I'm aware of, where we're not per se starting with a scripture in the Bible or taking a book of the Bible and working our way through. We are doing a study of church history from the close of the New Testament. Really, we kind of started before the New Testament even opened, but mainly from the close of the New Testament all the way through to the modern church, or what many call today as the postmodern church. So I won't go back into the whys, why we're doing this, because I did that the last 2 weeks. If you missed the first 2 weeks of this study, it's going to be an 8-part teaching. There are 8 major eras or 8 major periods of church history, and so we're trying to do one per week as we work our way through. We're on the 3rd one tonight, and I'm going to review those in just a second. But before I do, let me, again, I didn't say this last week, I did the first week, give you a couple of disclaimers. First of all, history is always subject to interpretation. If you pick any day in history, there's any number of 1,000 things that are happening at any particular point in the world. So when we're going through 2,000 years of church history, trying to determine what pieces are critical to the history of the church in America today is subject to opinion. And so you might know something about church history that you consider to be very important that I might skip over and leave out. I'm not intentionally doing that. I'm just trying to pick out the parts that I think are very relevant to us today. So I'll give you what I found, and then you can take the parts you know about and insert them where they belong. And then the second thing is, if history is open to interpretation, it's also subject to opinion. And I'm doing my very best to keep my opinion out of history, but that's not going to be possible because I'm telling it from my perspective, and we're telling it from 2016 looking backwards. And so sometimes I'll come across as though I'm being a little critical or something of that nature, and I'm not. I wasn't there, so I can't speak to what it must have been like for people at different periods of time. So we're trying our best to be as objective, neutral as possible. I'll let the Holy Spirit teach us individually what He wants us to see through this. But there are 8 major periods of church history, and we covered the first 2 already. The first one is the Apostolic Age. That's from the time of Christ until about the year 100 A.D. It's the age of the apostles. And so really, if we look at the condition of the church during this period of time, the church is persecuted. That persecution is going to continue on beyond even the apostolic age, but we see what happens rather than the message of the gospel or the message of the church being squelched. The message is actually spread. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It spreads rapidly, and it moves all through the Roman Empire and even beyond. So the persecution, while it's not an easy thing for the church, it is part of God's plan in spreading the news throughout the kingdom, throughout the Roman Empire, basically. The second age is from the apostles, the age of the apostles, to what's called the Council of Nicaea, which happens in 325. Now, the majority of that period, the church is also persecuted. People are taken from their homes, they're beaten, in many cases they're killed. They have to flee in the middle of the night because of the Romans who are persecuting. And if the Romans are persecuting, I'm guessing other citizens did that as well. Again, this spreads Christianity. But in 312 A.D., an emperor comes to power in the Roman Empire who is named Constantine. And Constantine either is a Christian or maybe he's just strategic in endorsing the Christians. But once he comes to power, he basically says that the Christians enabled him to be there. Now, in all likelihood, Constantine is a Christian. One of the things that he does is legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire. So no longer is the church persecuted. In fact, no longer is the church persecuted, but now that the emperor has endorsed the Christians and is likely a Christian himself, everybody wants to be a Christian. Now, this is really good for the church from the terms of statistics. It's really good if you're living in that period of time, because now you're not afraid for your life. You're not going to have to be beaten for not sacrificing to a Roman god or whatever the case may be. So in many ways, this is a very good thing. But in many ways, if we look at it from a detached perspective of 1,700 years later, it ends up being a bad thing for the church, because the church becomes very enmeshed with the Roman government. And when that begins to happen, now power is a part of it. Wealth is a part of what it means to be a Christian. And so we see a lot of people coming into the church under the name of Christianity, and they're just very casually committed to Christ, if they are at all. And again, we can't judge who they are. Tonight we're talking about from the Council of Nicaea to the fall of the Roman Empire. Let me talk about Council of Nicaea. They settled some doctrinal disputes. That council is really called by Constantine, so we have the Roman government kind of telling the church what they need to do to get their act straight. We don't want divisions in the church because it's enmeshed with the Roman government. If there's a split in the church, it can turn into a civil war in the government. So the government initiates action within the church. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Probably not so good. Maybe there is a good way of looking at that. All right, so let's pick up from the Council of Nicaea to the fall of the Roman Empire. And the first thing I want to talk about isn't the timeline of the history of Rome, but the first thing you have on your handout there is the New Testament canon is complete. Now, this is, we talked about the canonization of the Old Testament, the word canon there meaning a collection of sacred books that are used as a standard for comparison. So if we say the Old Testament was canonized, that means they've been scrutinized in detail, and that the scholars that have gathered there all agree that these books are divinely inspired and they contain the truth of God. So that happens with the Old Testament in AD 90. That's by the Jews. We now see that happening in the New Testament. We now have the Christian Bible, so to speak. That happens in two different councils. One is called the Council of Laodicea in 363, and also the Council of Carthage. So we take the Old Testament ratified by the Jews. Now we have a New Testament that has been ratified by two different councils, and we have our complete Bible. Now, there are two primary questions that these councils debated with every single book that's admitted into the canon of the New Testament. Probably wasn't this simplistic, but to summarize what they were asking, number one, does this book teach what the disciples of Jesus and eyewitnesses taught? So let's compare what's written in this book with what we've heard from eyewitnesses that have been passed down along the ages. Compare that to what these other disciples have written about Jesus. Do they all agree? And then the second question is, does it encourage and strengthen Christians in their faith? So this isn't be something that's for enjoyment that we're reading. It's something that's teaching us about how we can grow in the spirit realm, how we can grow in our service to Christ. Now, the Old Testament is written mainly in Hebrew, although there's a couple of books I think in there that are written in Aramaic. The New Testament is written in Greek. So we have three different languages involved if we say this is the full collection of the Bible. The majority of people in these days were not literate. They don't know how to read. One of the main reasons is the printing press hasn't been developed yet. I think the Chinese do a little something with this in maybe the 600s, the 7th century, something like that. But the Gutenberg press won't be until the Middle Ages, 1500s, I think. I don't know the exact date there. But books aren't very easy to make. They have to be manuscripted, manually scripted, a manuscript. So if you get a copy of the Scriptures, it's because someone sat down and copied word for word, line by line, a copy of the Bible that you would be able to have. So it's a major deal. Now, so if you had a copy of the Bible, you were probably an important church official. Now, this is important, number one, because you would have to speak the language that the original text is written in, or it wouldn't mean anything to you. The other thing is this would be a very carefully treated document. You wouldn't pass this around because they're very expensive, time-consuming to make. Now, that originally starts out because of the practicality and because of the language barriers. Eventually, we're going to see where the church turns this into the idea that common people should not read the Scriptures for themselves. That's going to be a major problem by the time we get to the Reformation, which will be in February, I think, is when we'll end up getting to the Reformation. So Scriptures are reserved for priests, clergymen, people who work in the church. All right, so there's the canonization of the New Testament. Let's jump back over and start talking about what's happening in the Roman Empire. So we saw last week that the Roman Empire had gotten difficult to manage because it covers so broad an area geographically. And so you can see on the map that several emperors have taken care to split that into two different regions. Now, it's still the same empire, but we've split it into, it's not a civil war that's happened here. Now we're against one another. This is really almost, maybe the comparison we could give it is we put it in two states because it makes governing a whole lot easier. So in the Western Roman Empire, we have a capital in Rome, and then in the Eastern Roman Empire, we have the main capital, which is Constantinople. All right, so that's where we left it last time. By the time we get to where we are in the 5th century, so in the 400s, we have barbaric tribes who begin to conquer the western half of the Roman Empire. Now, not the eastern half, that kind of remains intact for another 1,000 or so years. But on the Western Roman Empire, so the part that we're going to be mainly talking about, we have barbarians that come in and start taking over. What do we mean by barbarians? Well, here's a map that kind of shows you the different wars. It looks like a whole lot of stuff going on. And the reason it looks like a whole lot of stuff going on, because over a period of about 100 years, there was a whole lot of stuff going on. The groups that are represented there are the Angles, Saxons, Franks, Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Oshkoshbagoths, the Huns, and the Vandals. A whole lot of different tribal people, mainly from the Germany region, Germanic tribes. A whole lot of these small little loosely organized groups come in and begin to nibble away at the Roman Empire. And this is different than what has happened previously, because we've talked about an empire who masses an army and comes in and takes over someone else's empire and sets up camp there. This isn't the way the Roman Empire fell. You've heard the saying before that Rome was not built in a day. Well, Rome was not destroyed in a day either. It happens over a period of about 75 to 100 years, where these little tribal groups begin to come over and take over smaller, much more localized territory. So what's the effect of the church? Well, we have our country, Rome, rather than having an emperor now, we have an emperor, we have the bishop of Rome or the pope or the leaders of the church, however you want to look at that. We're all Christians. And so when our area, if you're living in any part of the Western Roman Empire, if, say, the Huns come in and take over the area you're living in, you're no longer a member of the Roman Empire, you're a member of the little Huns country, whatever it is they're setting up. And I'd have to have studied how they did that. But you get the point. As the Roman Empire sort of fragments, the church does exactly the opposite. The church consolidates its power in the most likely object of that. They begin to consolidate their power in the Bishop of Rome. So if you understand what's happening, we had an emperor over the whole kingdom. As this kingdom gets nibbled away, this emperor becomes less and less influential in the kingdom. And the church, because we're all citizens of two nations, right? We're a citizen of the kingdom of God first. We're Christians. And we're citizens of America second. Now, I don't say that as being unpatriotic. It's really easy to say if your guy or your girl didn't win the election, I'm citizen of heaven first, not America, that kind of a thing. That's really what people did, to say, well, we're members of the body of Christ. And so as the Roman Empire splits, the church seems to come together and consolidate all of its power in the Bishop of Rome. So as the emperor decreases in power because the Roman Empire is fragmenting, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, who would be the Bishop of Rome, later we'll just start calling him the Pope, he becomes more and more powerful and more influential. All right, here's what's happening in the church, though. A slow division of the Latin-speaking Christianity of the Western Roman Empire, which is now called Catholicism, and the Greek-speaking Christians of the Eastern Roman Empire, which we're later going to call Orthodox Christianity. There begins to be a split between the churches in the East and the churches in the West. Why? Well, one reason is a language. The majority of the people in the West are speaking Latin. The majority of the people in the East are speaking Greek. That's a bit of an annoyance. They can get beyond those problems, but the other issue is that the churches in the Western Roman Empire now have vastly different needs than the churches in the Eastern Roman Empire. Eastern Roman Empire is still pretty stable. Those churches aren't undergoing a lot of changes. The ones in the Western Roman Empire really are. And so we see a slow divide. Now, the church isn't going to formally split east and west until 1054. I mention it here because this is likely when it begins to cause a rift between the two. And the western half will become known what is Roman Catholicism, headquartered in, guess where? The city of Rome. The eastern half will become Orthodox Christianity, or you might hear it sometimes called Greek Orthodox. All right, so we have a slow division beginning in the church. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of zoom in on the United Kingdom part of what's happening in the Roman Empire. So if y'all can put that map back up there, if you'll look in the upper left corner, you see the little island nation of what we now know as the United Kingdom. That is part of the Roman Empire. There are three groups that will be primarily invading this part of the empire. Two things I want you to notice. They are far and disconnected away from the centralized activity that's going on in Rome. So if the headquarters of the Western Roman Empire is in Italy, England is a good way away from that. So they're kind of in their own little world up there, and it doesn't help a whole lot that they are an island unto themselves. So we have the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes that start moving into this particular area. So let's talk about what's going on in there. On your handout, you'll see there are three blocks that have sort of grayed out. Really, we just need to kind of zoom in on what's happening in these particular parts. This is what's happening in the local area of England. Well, why are we doing that? Because we're trying to trace the history of the church from Israel, from Jesus, all the way as it makes its way into the United States today. I know there are other parts of the church. We can't go there, so we're going to kind of zoom in on what's happening with England. All right, so Angles, Saxons, and Jutes are coming into what's called the United Kingdom. Well, what are they coming into? Well, the United Kingdom, and I'm not sure what it was called at that particular time. I think it was called Britannia, if I'm not mistaken. We have the Celtic Church, and some have called that church the Insular Church. What do we mean by that? Well, insular meaning that it is isolated and not really interested in whatever culture's happening beyond it. We're only interested in our own little culture. So they're sort of in their own little world up there. So we do have a Christian church that is connected to the church in Rome, but it's only connected loosely. The way they do things up there is vastly different because it becomes very much enmeshed with the culture. Not a bad thing at all. But they have all of these invading barbaric groups that come in that bring with them paganism. Now, what is paganism? Well, the word pagan actually means rural dweller. It refers to kind of a superstitious country folk. I don't believe there's ever been an organized pagan religion. So there's not a pagan church headquarters, at least at this time that I'm aware of. Paganism really is sort of, maybe it's got ties to Hinduism. I can't exactly figure that part out, but they have all of these superstitious beliefs. They are polytheistic, meaning they believe in more than one God. So you have a church that's very connected to the culture of the community, but then you have the community that's being invaded by people who are bringing with them all sorts of cultural practices as they go. So the church sort of becomes diluted by the paganism that comes in. And I'm going to talk specifically about three of the things that paganism brings into the church. It's not clear whether the church officially adopts some of these practices, but some writers would say that the Celtic church almost becomes polytheistic, which would totally not be Christianity at all. So there comes this guy named Patrick. You probably have heard of him before. Now, if you go to try to read about Patrick, there's 100 different things that are written. Some will say this isn't true, while the other says this is true about Patrick. I'm going to try to stay with what is fairly commonly agreed on among Patrick. He lives from about 390 to 460, and really he becomes an evangelist to Ireland. Well, how does he do that? He lives in Great Britain. When he's 16 years old, he's captured by Irish pirates, and he's taken to Ireland as a slave. Try saying Irish pirates 10 times. He's captured while he's just out working one day in the field. I guess they come and nab him, tie him up, carry him off to Ireland, and he works his 6 years for 6 years as a slave. Well, eventually he escapes. He goes back to his house, his home. He finishes his education and becomes a clergy, whatever that looks like in the Celtic church. He becomes a priest, clergyman, whatever they called him at the time. And then his heart really turns back to Ireland, and he realizes that the church in this particular region is really in bad shape. It's not following what it means to be a Christian at all. And so Patrick becomes an apostle. Some would call him an evangelist. Some would call him, he's later named by the Catholic Church as a saint, which is a whole nother thing we won't get into. He primarily wants to bring this church back to monotheism. So one of his favorite teaching tools is a shamrock, where he takes the shamrock and he shows how that is one leaf of the shamrock that is comprised of 3 petals: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So he uses the shamrock to teach the doctrine of the Trinity. This is why we have green and shamrocks and all that. I don't think he was ever into beer and parades, but probably into shamrocks and green, quite possibly. Tradition says that he dies on March the 17th of the year 460. That's disputed. Other people have different dates, but when we celebrate St. Patrick's Day on March the 17th, and we talk about we're proud to be Irish, if you are Irish, and that's the one day, even if you aren't, you say you are. So proud to be Irish. That's really what it's all about with Patrick. Now, so let's talk about where we are. We've got the pagans and all their traditions that are coming into the church. It's really changed the church up in Ireland. Great Britain changed it a lot, the Celtic church. Patrick comes in and begins to re-evangelize. So it's not really clear when we get down to some of these pagan practices, which I'll probably start a firestorm tonight as to whether you observe these things or not. I'll probably ruin Christmas for some of you, so I apologize for that. But let's talk about 3 of the things that come in with the pagans that we still sort of do even in churches today. All right, so one of the beliefs of the pagans as they come into England, Great Britain, Ireland, all of these places, is they bring in this thought that on a certain, so if you died, according to the pagans, if someone dies during the year, their soul is sort of held in the suspended state, not dead but not alive either, until one particular day of the year when all of the souls would be released to find their way to where it is they're going. So that would be a very scary day if you're a pagan. That's a day to kind of stay home because all these dead spirits are going to be wandering around. Well, one of the things the pagans would do to keep the dead spirits away would be to hollow out turnips. Now, we're pretty sure there weren't pumpkins because I don't think they had pumpkins in Ireland. Does anybody know if that's true or not? I read it on Facebook, so it must be true. So they say they would hollow out turnips and put faces in the turnips with a candle on the inside as a way of scaring off the spirits. In the United States, we do that with pumpkins. We call them jack-o'-lanterns. We do that with pumpkins because Americans always do things bigger and better. So that is where that comes from. Second one, Christmas trees. That's why I said it's going to end up ruining Christmas, start a firestorm. I know you're probably going to send me emails tomorrow. So the pagans believed that there were gods who lived in evergreen trees. And so on the winter solstice, I believe it is, an evergreen tree would be brought into someone's house and offerings would be hung on the tree. They would decorate the tree as a way of appeasing the gods so that their year would be blessed, all right? The third one is Easter eggs. Of course, they didn't call them Easter eggs back then. Probably the term Easter egg is something that the church has put in there later. They were a celebration of rabbits and eggs because this had to do with fertility in the spring. So you would want to be on good graces with the fertility gods is where we get Easter eggs and Easter rabbits. Now that I've ruined all of your childhood and you're no longer going to be able to celebrate anything with your children anymore, here's the million-dollar question. How should the church be responding to these things? Now on your handout, I did give the Christian church the benefit of the doubt by saying that they've adopted these practices in an effort to evangelize the pagans. So how do we feel about this and how the church has brought in some of the traditions of the pagans? And now that I've backed myself into the corner so that I can't win with anyone, because there'll be some of you on both sides of that issue. We did this. I taught this in the college group a couple of weeks ago, and when we got to this particular point, we can do discussions in that group. And I just kind of threw it out. Normally all the college kids, if they're awake, when I ask them a question, they don't have anything to say. But boy, did they have things to say about this one. This discussion went on for a long time. How do we feel about this? And the bigger question is, what about churches who celebrate all of these traditions? They come through the Celtic church, but they really have their roots in paganism. Is this something we should be doing? Are we inviting a curse on ourselves? How does God feel about these things? They're all extremely difficult questions. So I'm going to make 3 statements that I hope and pray will get me out of the pit I've dug myself into. Maybe 4, if I need a 4th. First of all, what began in pagan tradition 1,600 years ago and has changed and morphed and become something different over a period of 1,600 years does not in any way reflect what it used to. So that's the first thing that I'm going to throw out there. In the American culture, all 3 of these particular traditions have really taken on a life of their own, and the life they've taken on in the American culture is nowhere near the original meaning that they had back in the pagan days. If you were not spiritual enough that at your house you carved a jack-o'-lantern on Halloween, then I doubt very seriously anyone who carved a pumpkin for Halloween was actually trying to ward off evil spirits. I don't think any of you sat that on your front porch and ran in the house and hid on Halloween night because you're terrified that evil spirits are coming out. So your observance of that had absolutely nothing to do with the origins of it. If you put up a Christmas tree in your house here in a couple of weeks, like we will at my house, I don't think anybody is sacrificing to gods who live in evergreen trees. I don't think we're doing that for blessings. So they've taken on a tradition of their own. The second thing is I want to read to you from 1 Corinthians because that was nothing new in the New Testament time. So if we go back to what has now been canonized in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul has to address some of these things that happen very similar with the Corinthians. So here's what Paul writes to the Corinthians in chapter 9, verse 20. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. So really we can look at these things, these activities that we're doing as great points of connection in order to try to evangelize people. So here a few weeks ago we had a family fest. Now we don't call it a Halloween party or anything of the sort. We call it Family Fest, but you will have kids dressing up as characters and going from trunk to trunk getting candy, very similar to how people would be doing it on Halloween. For us as a church, it's a fantastic opportunity for us to connect with the community in a way they understand. They don't know, in many cases, how church works. They know how Halloween works, so let's connect with them in that tradition and see if we can't make some connecting points to bring them in the church. It's one of the reasons that I'm hopeful that that's the way it began with the Celtic church, however you say that. I think it's the Boston Celtics. Maybe these guys are the Celtics. I'm always confused with that. Anyway, we're hoping that's how it will begin. When my kids were little, I took them trick-or-treating incognito. Some of you think I'm of the devil. But it was the one time of the year I got to meet my neighbors as we went from door to door. And so it became a great way for us to be able to connect with them. All right, third thing, let me say, here's Paul writing again to the Corinthians one chapter earlier because he's talking about food that has been literally given before an idol in a sacrifice. So if you're wanting to talk about some unholy practices, where butchering animals and spilling its blood before a false god and now I'm going to take that into my home and partake of it. I'm going to eat it. Sounds like an awful, horrible thing to do. What does Paul have to say about that? 1 Corinthians 8:4. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. And then I'm going to skip down to verse 9 because he talks about some other things in there. Then he gives us this. He said, be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Are there dead spirits who roam about on Halloween night? No, they're all cute little kids dressed up in costumes. Are we fearful of those things? No, we are not. So are these things overtaking us spiritually? My personal opinion is no, they're not. However, some of you come from situations or you have been raised in a certain way where this is a stumbling block for you. This is a problem. And so it's fine for you not to observe it, and it's fine for the other person, in my opinion, if they do observe it. But we should never flaunt our liberty in front of someone else if it's going to cause them to stumble. So you'll see on our little inserts when we do the Family Fest, please don't dress up offensively. What do we mean by that? Things that are going to make other people go places in their mind they really shouldn't go. All right? So let's do two more things because I'm out of time. Let's talk about the last two items on the timeline here. And we will have completed all the way through the fall of the Roman Empire. So the city of Rome is conquered by the barbarians. The bishop of Rome, I think technically later he's become the pope. We're just going to start calling him the pope now, is the last remnant of the Western Roman Empire. And again, we've had that whole thing turned upside down. Well, why? All right, remember when the Romans had all of this territory, they have to find a way to rule the people in all of this territory. You don't want anybody uprising because that could spread and you're not going to be able to manage these people who outnumber you. So the way you managed those people back then was you appease them by appointing rulers that they will submit to, but who will also be your puppet ruler. In many cases, it was the ruler that was already in place. We've seen this whole thing turn upside down when it comes to the Pope and the Emperor, because now we don't have an emperor of the Roman Empire. We've got all of these barbaric tribal leaders ruling over these small geographic areas. Well, they don't have massive armies to be able to control these people. How are they going to have peace in their region? Well, really, they need the one guy that can unite everyone in their country, and that person is the Pope. So now, rather than smaller rulers doing the bidding of the emperor, we have these smaller rulers who are going to the Pope, the head of the church, to try to get his endorsement, his blessing from God, because if the Pope will bless the ruler and validate him as the ruler, then the people who are Christians in his territory will likely will do peacefully. Very similar to how Donald Trump is doing right now. All of those people he offended when he's going for the White House, now he's got to try to find a way to appease them, and he needs the endorsement of people who can unite them. All right? And then one last thing, the Pope's rise to power begins what many historians call the Dark Ages or Middle Ages. We're going to talk about that in the next time. It won't be next week. That's our Thanksgiving break, but the time beyond that. Now, why is it called the Dark Ages? It really isn't because like it's a dark period in American history, although some would say that, but it's because there's a lack of records, and for a period of about 1,000 or 1,100 years, there's very little literature, very little art, and scientific research is really kind of suppressed during these periods. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is because it's a period we know little about, little happens, and we're comparing that to the Enlightenment period or the Light period, which comes after that. So that's why you'll often hear it called the Dark Ages. All right, so here's the way we're going to leave the church. The church has now become a massive powerhouse. We see the Eastern Orthodox, they're kind of doing their own thing, and we're going to leave them alone. That was the church that existed in Eastern Rome. The Western church, since it gets nibbled away, now the Pope basically fills the office of the emperor. He's almost like an emperor of influence. If the Pope endorses you, you're powerful. If the Pope won't endorse you, you've got problems. And that's so far in 590 years. That is so very different than how the church starts out. And again, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? It's good in many ways. It's a bad thing because we're about to enter a period where all of that power and influence changes people. We have the wrong people come into office as Pope, and we have a lot of problems within the church. The greatest test the Lord sometimes gives us, so our modern application to that, the greatest test the Lord sometimes gives us isn't in failure, but in success. And how you handle success shows a lot more about your character than failure ever can.